It is a real pleasure to be back, and welcome to all of you from across Canada. Let me take a moment to situate today's session. This is a companion to how to engage DoD end users. That earlier session, which you can get on video on CCC's website, focused on how needs form, how end users shape requirements, and how trust builds before anything reaches the contracting shop. Today picks up at the next step. When requirements do get to contracting, the people who are there have a different job. They're not discovering requirements. They're deciding whether an action is safe to execute. Contracting is optimizing for three things. Compliance. Does this follow the rules? Ease. Does this create unnecessary friction, or does it make the action straightforward? And confidence. Am I comfortable signing this? Will it hold up? Does everything make sense on the record? Everything we'll talk about today, how you engage, what you share, and how you show up, is designed to support these three things. If you watch CCC's earlier sessions, engaging DoD contracting, building a DoD sales plan, or how and why to win micro purchases, then you've seen the orientation. Today is the applied layer. We're going deeper on how end user pull becomes something that contracting can execute with compliance, ease, and confidence. Sound good? I'm going to assume that people who are in the room today represent a mix of backgrounds. So whether you are an experienced exporter, you've sold to corporate, you're selling to DND, you are established in the United States corporate market. If some of this feels familiar, great. We're going to go deeper. If some of it feels new, that's also fine. Stick with the principles. Be present, take notes. Your AI is welcome in the room. Respond to questions or polls if we've got them, and use the chat or Q&A box. Anu and Georgia will be looking, and if there's something that is on point, I welcome them to put a hand up and ask me in the middle, and I really want to leave time for questions at the end as well. So please stay engaged with me. Sound good? If it is, give me a thumbs up. We're doing a little chat activation here. You with us? Yes. All right. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so welcome. Let me be clear about what we're here to do today. This session isn't about teaching you the federal acquisition regulations, and it's not about convincing contracting to do something they don't want to do. Our focus today is on the person in the contracting role, the person who has to review the file, make the call, and put their name on the contract action. We'll have been successful by the end of the session if you understand three things. First, what the contracting professional needs to see in order to feel comfortable and confident. Second, how end user pull, the requirements demand, becomes something that's actually safe to execute. And third, what low risk steps they're willing to take to move forward. Everything we'll cover today, how you engage, what you share, and how you show up, is designed to support these outcomes. Because when contracting feels comfortable, the process moves. And if they don't, it doesn't. If you joined us for the end user session, we spent time on the contracting officer's representative burden. And today we're looking at the other side of that handoff, because the contracting shop itself carries a different kind of accountability. You'll recall this slide showing how end users and contracting relate structurally in the DoD buying ecosystem. Today, we're only focusing on this one layer: contracting officers and contracting specialists. This session is about whether and how buying decisions are executed. Because you've learned to create trust and remove friction up here in those top two boxes, you've set yourself up to smoothly open what many people think is a heavy door when it's time to engage with folks in the contracting layer later. Contracting exists to serve and protect the end user layer. Here's how contracting sees these layers. End users identify the need and feel the risk. Embedded subject matter experts, that's still folks that are in the end user layer, validate the technical scope. The contracting officer's representative, an end user in a highly special role, they're the liaison between the end user role and contracting, and they formalize the requirements and support the file. They're also the ones who sign off and say, yep, that got done right, you should pay them. The contracting layer selects the acquisition strategy and executes it. Small business specialists, they're not even on the map right now. They provide mission support, but they are not there to decide whether or not Canadian companies can participate. The key takeaway, when contracting engages, they are responding to the work of requirement definitions that's already been done upstream in the end user shop. So before we get into contracting role, there's one thing you need to normalize. The relationship between the contracting shop and the end user layer varies a lot. In some organizations, it's a warm, productive partnership. Everybody's working together, moving in the same direction. In other shops, the end users experience contracting as the purchasing prevention department, and contracting thinks that end users should not be given 5 cents to buy bubble gum. They are always trying to stop each other from doing stuff. And as Marine Corps veteran Forrest Gump would say, you never know what you're going to get. What matters today for our purposes isn't which environment you're in. It's understanding that the people in the contracting role needs in either environment. In order to move forward, it's the same buying ecosystem we've been working in all along. End users define the need. Program and project managers and cores translate that need into something that can be executed. And then it lands here at the bottom layer with contracting. At this point, the work is no longer what someone wants. It's about whether what's been defined can be executed cleanly, defensibly, and in a way that the person signing the contract is willing to stand behind. That's what we're going to unpack right now. Let's talk about what contracting actually does. At this stage, their job is not discovery. It is not shaping the mission, and it's not advocacy. Their job is execution within the rules. They ensure compliance with the Federal Acquisition Regulations and the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, DFARS. They select the acquisition strategy. They manage thresholds and competition. They assess risk, protest risk, performance risk, and audit risk. And then they sign. That signature is not symbolic. It's personal. Before I go any further, I want to pause here for a moment. So let's talk about risk from the contracting professional's point of view. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to answer this in the chat. What's the worst thing that can happen to the contracting officer if a contracting decision goes wrong? Go ahead. I want you to type it in the chat. What could go wrong? No wrong answers. Just type what comes to mind. Colin says criminal charges. You're real close. Yeah. Just type what else comes to mind. What's the worst thing that could happen to the contracting officer if things go tango uniform? Firing, says Ray. What else? Negative performance review and firing. Those things are possible. Getting fired, says John. Services not in compliance with the standard. Indeed. Loss of reputation. Yep. And a lot of the negative review, a lot of the time as well. And this is why, one of the reasons why it's so important. You're high risk, no more contracts, Megan. Yes, that is definitely a problem, but that's a problem for you. Loss of their accreditation, says Susanna. Questionable IP. All of these things. Yeah, these are all possible negative consequences. Protests, audits, investigations, career damage. But there's one thing that matters more than most people realize. And Colin got the edge of it right away. These rules and regulations don't exist on their own. They're implementing laws. And when laws are broken, especially knowingly or repeatedly, that can carry personal legal consequences. In extreme cases, those consequences can include criminal liability. That's prison. Does that happen often? No, but it does happen. And the person in the contracting role lives with the weight of that possibility every day. That's why compliance matters so much. It's not just bureaucracy, it's the personal consequences of professional accountability. And that's why their questions to you sound the way they do. Before we go any further, I want to get the language right because in DoD, acronyms matter. KO in DoD means contracting officer. CO means commanding officer. Same letters, different roles. In the contracting shop, you'll also hear people talk about their warrant. They're not talking about a warrant officer, and they're not talking about a warrant to arrest somebody. They're talking about their contracting warrant. That warrant is a formal certification. It defines the limits of their buying authority. It may authorize a contracting officer to sign contracts or modifications for amounts ranging from a few $1,000s all the way up to the big gazilla and unlimited warrant without higher level dollar approval. So when you're working with contracting, you're talking about the CO, not a military, or the KO, not the military CO. Within the contracting office, the work is shared. The contracting officer holds the legal authority. They make the final decision and they sign. The contracting specialist hands much of the day-to-day execution. They manage the process, they build the file, they coordinate inputs. Both roles matter, but only one bears that legal authority and consequences. Knowing who you're talking to and using the right language matters more than most companies realize. When you zoom out, contracting isn't optimizing for speed. They're not optimizing for convenience, and they're not optimizing for what a vendor wants. They're optimizing for three things. First, compliance. Does what we're trying to do follow the law and the regulations that implement it? And for those of you dreaming of sole source awards, that includes one very specific question. Did we conduct maximum practicable competition? Second, defensibility. If this decision is questioned or reviewed later by leadership, auditors, or through a protest, can it be defended? And does the file tell a clean, complete story, including why we did anything other than full and open competition? And third, execution. Can this actually be carried out cleanly without creating downstream problems? Those three priorities shape the questions the contracting shop asks. They shape how cautious they sound. And they shape why some requests feel slow or rigid from the outside. If you ignore these priorities, you create friction. If you design for them, you make it safer for contracting to say yes. So when you put these three things together, compliance, defensibility, and execution, you start to see something important. From contracting's perspective, the question is rarely, do I like this vendor? It's almost always, can I safely execute this? And that's where many well-intentioned companies lose momentum. Not because their solution is bad, but because what they're bringing forward creates friction instead of reducing it. So this is where we look at what actually helps contracting move forward, and by contrast, what unintentionally makes their job harder. Once you see contracting's optimization lens, these patterns become more obvious. What helps is anything that makes execution safer. Clarity, documentation, a clean path to compliance. What hurts is anything that introduces uncertainty, ambiguity, unexplained exceptions, or asking someone to rely on confidence instead of defensibility. More friction with contracting isn't about resistance, it's about risk, and whether the person doing the signing can sleep at night after they do. Most vendors don't intend to create friction with contracting, they just don't realize when they're doing it. Friction shows up when you ask for an exception without doing the work to justify it, when you push for speed before requirements are actually executable, or when compliance is treated like a hurdle instead of the operating rules. And some of that can just come through your tone and whether or not you get all huffy about them asking for the same document for the third time in a row. None of this feels unreasonable from the vendor side, but from the contracting side, each one of those experiences increases uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what they're paid to reduce. Another common source of friction is arriving without doing the research. Presenting yourself to someone with purchasing authority, but who doesn't actually serve anyone who needs what you do, or assuming contracting will immediately understand where you fit. They won't. And it's not their job to figure that out for you. When you show up at the door and say, "How can I help you?" You're giving them homework. You think they didn't wake up with enough stuff to do this morning already? Then there's entitlement. And American companies do this with discouraging frequency. Canadians are much less likely to make this mistake, partly because they're not eligible for preferences as American small businesses. American companies, regrettably, all too frequently show up as if small business certification or any other preference like a trade agreement creates a right to an award. Small business programs create opportunity. Trade agreements create access. They don't reduce or replace the need for compliance, justification, and defensible decisions. There's one more source of friction that shows up constantly, and it's not about strategy. It's about response. Responding late, responding incompletely, or responding with visible frustration at being asked something for the umpteenth time. Asking why something is needed isn't wrong, but the question matters only if it helps the work move forward. What contracting needs is a thorough, timely, courteous, and patient response, one that reduces uncertainty and friction rather than amplifying it, because every poor response creates friction, and friction is simply another form of uncertainty. People will forget what you did. People may forget what you said, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And they may still remember all those other things. Once you understand how contracting is thinking, helpful behavior becomes pretty clear. Helpful looks like clarity, being explicit about where you fit, and just as important, articulating your knowledge of where you don't. It looks like responsiveness, timely, complete answers that move the work forward. It looks like documentation, not marketing material, but information that's technically complete and supports a defensible decision. And it looks like realism, paths to compliance that are achievable, not theoretical. All this reduces uncertainty, and reducing uncertainty is what makes execution move forward. Everything on this list reduces uncertainty, but the last one matters more than most people expect. Contracts don't fail because nothing ever goes wrong. They fail because of how people handle problems when they happen. From the Canadian or contracting perspective, problems are inevitable. What they're watching for is judgment. Do issues surface early? Is responsibility taken? Is there a compliant path forward? That's not about being perfect. That's about being trustworthy under pressure. That's exactly why micro-engagement works so well with contracting. It reduces uncertainty, builds confidence over time, and demonstrates judgment before the stakes are high. Once you see contracting through this lens, a few things become clear. Contracting isn't optimizing for preference, including small business preference. They're managing risk. And trust with contracting doesn't suddenly appear at contract award. It forms way before the stakes are high. That's where small, well-timed actions matter. Each one reduces uncertainty. Each one builds confidence. Think of each of those actions as putting a marble in a jar marked trust. The fuller the jar, the larger the action the buyer is willing to take. That's the real power of micro-engagement. It aligns with what we know from real-world research about how trust is formed, not just in contracting, but everywhere between us as human beings. Given what contracting is responsible for, and how and when they actually have influence, what kinds of small early interactions reduce risk instead of creating it? Let's set up the constraints. Micro-engagement with contracting must respect timing constraint, authority constraint, and risk constraint. Let's start with timing. Contracting is most influential after requirements are defined, during market research validation, while shaping acquisition strategy, during vendor selection, and throughout contract administration. The implication for micro-engagement: early interactions must support future decisions, not try to force current ones. Micro-engagements with contracting are rarely about deciding. They're about making future decisions easier and safer. Think of contracting as your A-team. They don't pick winners casually. They can't promise outcomes, and they cannot advocate without justification. Very specifically, they're ones with the authority to say, this Canadian firm can participate and here's why. Or to document, this Canadian firm is out and here's why. That means everything you do and say either adds support to the file or creates friction. Over time, those interactions accumulate. They reach a point where contracting has enough confidence and enough justification to move you to the next stage of consideration. Oh, and once you win, they're the ones that you send the invoice to so you can get paid. And if something goes wrong, including anything that could lead to a protest, whether you raise it or someone raises it against you, they're exactly the ones you want on your side. The implication for micro-engagement: helpful engagement does 4 things. It feeds the file in a good way. It clarifies options. It reduces the unknowns. It documents rationale. If an interaction can't be defended later, it's not helpful, no matter how friendly it feels. The third constraint contracting operates under is risk, and not risk in the abstract. Risk in very specific practical terms. First, legal and regulatory risk. Does this action comply with the law and the regulations that implement it? Second, protest and audit risk. If this decision is challenged later, can it be defended? Third, mission and execution risk. Will this work in the real world on the timeline required without creating downstream problems? And fourth, reputational and personal risk. Because the consequences of a bad decision don't stay on paper. What's important to understand is this: risk is cumulative. One unknown usually doesn't stop a decision, but multiple unknowns do. And risk tolerance shrinks as dollar value, visibility, and complexity increase. That's why contracting often appears so conservative. It's not resistance, it's risk management. And here's the key takeaway for today. Contracting isn't deciding whether they like you. They're deciding whether or not they can stand behind the decision. Because that's why the work that reduces risk has to start before they're in the driver's seat. This is the connective tissue between everything we've talked about so far. What we're calling micro-engagement works with contracting because it directly reduces risk. It reduces unknowns early before decisions are irreversible. It reduces unknowns early before decisions are irreversible. It improves the quality of market input, so contracting isn't guessing about whether or not there are a lot of vendors or only one that can do the job. It creates context that can be documented and defended later. And most importantly, it builds confidence before the stakes rise. This isn't about persuasion. It's about making the decision easier to stand behind. That's why micro-engagement doesn't replace formal process. It supports it. This slide explains a lot of contracting behavior that otherwise can feel frustrating. At the bottom left corner, it's the micro purchase level. Risk is low. Dollar exposure is small. Visibility is limited. If something goes wrong, the blast radius is contained. As you move up the arrow to the right into simplified acquisition, risk increases, scrutiny increases. The file has to stand up. And once you're above that threshold, everything changes. Higher visibility, bigger consequences, more people looking at that decision. Now here's the key point, right at the bottom. Micro-engagement supports every stage. It doesn't just start at the simplified acquisition threshold. It doesn't start when contracting is in the driver's seat. It starts at the bottom low left corner when risk is low, and it quietly reduces risk as the stakes rise. By the time you're asking for a bigger decision, that decision already feels safer. In a nutshell, this is why we devoted an entire webinar to micro purchases, and I'll recap the link where you can get that replay at the end. The only thing that has changed since last year is the value of micro purchases permanently increased 50% from $10,000 to $15,000 in October of 2025. They're the natural first step after non-revenue micro engagements. At this level, the U.S. federal government is willing to pay you to learn whether you can work together. How good is that? The risk is low, the exposure is limited, and the learning is real. There are no small business set-aside preferences for American companies. The Buy American Act does not apply. So the decisions turn on fit, performance, and responsiveness. For Canadian companies, this is often the cleanest way to move from relationship building into paid work without triggering constraints that appear later. You can find out more about that in the details in Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 13. Run, do not walk. Write it down, bookmark it for later. You'll want to know, and you'll be glad you did. Now things get interesting. Once a requirement moves above $15,000 but hasn't crossed $350,000, you're in a very different risk zone. This is where Canadian firms can feel like they're on thin ice. On paper, these actions are presumed reserved for American small business, and a company that is based solely in Canada does not meet the definition of small under Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 19, unless there is no reasonable expectation of getting offers from at least two responsible small business concerns. So you're now in a zone where relationships and relationship development matter a lot. Up to this point, we've talked about the rule. Now we need to talk about authority. Under simplified acquisition procedures, contracting is not on autopilot. It's never actually on autopilot. The contracting officer is allowed to determine whether qualified American small businesses actually exist to fulfill that requirement. They're allowed to also consider urgency, integration complexity, and mission risk. They're allowed to rely on what end users say and what the performance record already shows. And when those factors line up, they are allowed to proceed unrestricted, not casually, not automatically, not arbitrarily, but when it's justified. What makes that last line a clean, supportable file? That file has to stand up to audit. It has to stand up to questions. It has to explain clearly and according to the rules why the decision made sense at the time it was made. This is what vendors can sometimes get wrong. They think that simplified acquisition is about preference. It isn't. It's about whether contracting can defend the decision. And every interaction you have before this moment either helps build that justification or make it harder. That's why micro-engagement matters, because it gives contracting something real to point to when they exercise that authority. But this is also the moment where everything you've done before starts to matter. All that relationship building below the micro purchase threshold, all those small contracts, clean performance, quiet follow-through, this is where they carry real weight. Because contracting isn't deciding based on preference. They're deciding based on whether risk can be defended. So this is the moment where Canadian firms have to show up differently, clearer, safer, easier to justify. All right, I'm going to tackle this stereotype and make it work for us. Who's heard Americans talk about Canadians as nice? We've all heard it. I was trying to figure out how to do that in contracting terms. Nice means no surprises. Nice means you tell them who you are up front. Nice means you understand the rules before you ask for exceptions. Nice means when something goes wrong, you raise it early and help solve it. That's not personality, that's risk discipline. From contracting's perspective, that kind of nice is gold. It lowers uncertainty, makes the file defensible, makes them comfortable saying, yes, this firm is Canadian, but the risk is understood and manageable. Heck, if DoD can make up acronyms, so can we. What if we made nice operational? Here we go. You can write this down. A different kind of nice. All right. So they're not trying to change this perception, but make it work for you. So framed in risk-reducing behavior, when I say dial up the Canadian nice factor, this is what I mean in contracting terms. Again, nice means no surprises. Nice means tell them who you are up front. Here we go. Nationality up front, no surprises later. You understand the rules they're operating under. Compliant, exceptional value and performance, and enough to offset perceived risk. It's not about charm. It's making contracting comfortable with putting their name in the file. So nice nationality up front, informed, you understand the DFARS that gave you access, compliant and fully documented to prove it, and exceptional value enough to offset perceived risk. Sound good? You can pause that reflex to resist the urge to act. More effort doesn't build more trust. Speed doesn't always equal progress, and silence doesn't mean failure. Silence sometimes means they're stopping to think, and respecting that and not pestering them can also be important. So you've really also got to be prepared to use judgment. If end users typically don't show up at networking venues, the contracting staff actually go a long way to avoid networking venues, not least because risk. The very informal conversation you'd so love to have is exactly the same one they don't want to have coming back to bite them in the backside months from now when you win a contract and a competitor stands up and says to the contracting officer who talked to you that they gave you an unfair advantage by not sharing the same information with everybody. So what's a contractor to do? You find contracting folks at decision venues, moments when work is being structured, reviewed, or documented. Some of these are internal to government. Others are structured interfaces where industry input's appropriate and expected. Think about market research activities, sources sought and requests for information, acquisition planning conversations, contract administration touchpoints, program office coordination. Contracting is in their files every day, and they show up where decisions can be defended, not where vendors pitch. Many of these begin with the same kinds of conversations you're already having, just framed around clarity, risk, and options, not outcomes. So take a moment and mentally, I want you to circle one place where contracting already intersects with work that you know about. You don't have to put this in the chat. This is about narrowing your focus, not expanding effort. I want you to look at this list and give me a thumbs up when you've picked at least one of these things that represents a place where you are, where you can show up, where you're going, oh yeah, I could do that. I can see where I could participate in this. Give me a thumbs up. Yeah. Yep. We got a couple because these are important. Yes. Now I'm seeing lots of thumbs up. Yeah, you're getting it because these are important places to show up and they are very different from industry days or trade shows, but they're critical. And that is a key to success that many people are stopped by. There are not many valid ways to approach contracting and the order matters. The cleanest entry is when an end user brings you across. They show up with their arm draped around you and say, here's someone I want to work with. How might this work? Yummy. At this point, contracting's role isn't to block you. It's to assess whether this can be done defensively. The second is quieter. You understand who this office supports. You understand their mission context. You're not asking for a purchase. There's no urgency. You're saying, here's who I support. Here's how I reduce risk for them. I'd value your perspective. That's not outreach. That's a disciplined introduction. And sometimes a small business specialist, even though they don't have to do this, helps make an introduction. They don't owe you that, and they can't override a contracting officer's judgment. You enter the contracting world by making their job easier, not by asking for exceptions, by helping them apply rules with confidence. One of our earlier webinars, the data diving session, walked through many of these sources in detail. I'll recap that link at the end. More recently, we showed how you can use LinkedIn and public data to narrow thousands of DoD contracting professionals down to the right ones, and then decide how to make a first move that actually makes sense. Those same steps apply when you're engaging the contracting layer. That data is there to help you decide who to engage and who not to before you ever reach out. If all this data is available for free online right now, your DoD buyer is not surprised when you show up informed. Showing up informed isn't rude. It's respectful. It shows you understand their mission, who they support, what they buy, how much they buy, and when the contracts are up for renewal. What does surprise and disappoint them is when you don't. In DoD environments, they recognize the hunters, mission-focused, clear objective, no wasted motion. They respect those who are farming, people who cultivate relationships over time, understand timing, and work within real constraints. They have very little patience for people on fishing expeditions, which show up with questions like, do you have any contracts I could do? Yeah, people really ask that. Don't be that person. Now, CCC is not an entry strategy. It's a risk reduction mechanism, and it only works once risk already feels manageable. To get there, Canadians have to do a little hard work first. Let's ground this in how contracting actually experiences risk. As contract value goes up, risk goes up. As risk goes up, scrutiny goes up with it. That's not philosophical. That's procedural. More eyes, more justification, more downstream consequences if things go wrong. This is where people often misunderstand the role of CCC. CCC absolutely helps mitigate higher risk decisions. But CCC is not used to create comfort where none exists. Contracting doesn't say, we're unsure about this vendor, so let's bring in CCC. They say, we're already comfortable. Now we need a structure that reduces exposure, or now we'd appreciate a structure that reduces exposure. So CCC engages after that confidence exists, after the buyer understands the vendor, after performance, fit, and judgment have been demonstrated. CCC doesn't replace the trust that you need to build as a supplier. It formalizes it. And that sequence matters because when you try to bring in CCC too early, it raises more questions instead of answering them. Micro purchases are designed to intentionally move fast. They're low dollar, low friction, low administrative risk. At this level, contracting doesn't need sovereign guarantees, bilateral structures, or external risk backstopping. They just need to know one thing. Can this vendor perform cleanly, predictably, right now? That's why direct vendor performance is enough here. And it's also why CCC is not active in this tier. CCC doesn't reduce risk at this level. It would, if they were involved, it would add process where none is required. So if you're a Canadian company, the takeaway is simple. This is where you prove you can deliver quietly, reliably, and without complication. Not because CCC is unimportant. It's very important. But because the contract is too small to justify it. This is like the bottom of the mountain. It's where trust starts accumulating, but not where structure is helpful yet. CCC doesn't operate inside the simplified acquisition threshold for a very specific reason. Below the simplified acquisition threshold, U.S. acquisition policy is designed to preserve and encourage opportunities for American small businesses. The trade agreements carve out small business set-asides. That carve-out exists even when a capable foreign supplier is available. It's not discretionary, it's structural. So below that $350,000 threshold, contracting has some constraints on how they can maneuver even if a Canadian firm performs well, even when the end user prefers continuity. The system is doing what it was designed to do. And that's exactly why simplified acquisition performance, what you're doing on contract awards you can win worth more than $15,000 US and less than $350,000 matter so much. Because while CCC can't be used there, trust is being built there. Familiarity is being earned there. Risk is quietly being reduced. That's why the right time to introduce CCC is after successful delivery that you do as a prime contractor under $350,000. Not to bypass rules, not as a requirement, not as a pitch, but to give contracting a way to make things even easier when the rules change. You're essentially saying, you've now seen how we work, how we deliver, and how low friction this whole experience can be. If down the road, a larger requirement emerges, there's an established path that lets you keep this same team to work with us without increasing your risk. That's when CCC makes sense. So, or you could say something like, enjoy working with us. If something larger comes up, there's a structure that lets you keep this relationship and make contracting even easier, not harder. That structure is CCC. No action needed right now. Just wanted to let you know. Or you could say, hey, we'd like to chat with you about how Canadian Commercial Corporation becomes a risk management option on bigger contracts that may be down the road. It's how contracting preserves continuity, same vendor, same performance, while meeting a higher threshold of security and confidence. That only works when trust already exists. Within the simplified acquisition threshold, all kinds of things can happen for you as a vendor when trust is built successfully. Your buyer can decide that there aren't enough American small businesses to set the competition aside and runs it as a full and open competition. The contracting officer can recommend that the Canadian firm submit an offer as a subcontractor in a legitimate, compliant relationship or partnership to an American firm. The DoD buyer can decide to purchase through a mandatory source of supply, like a General Services Administration schedule contract for which Canadian companies are eligible, which takes precedence over the rule of two, which is the requirement to look for at least 2 American small businesses that can do the requirement. And finally, do not push for this because it involves much more risk and justification. They could decide to sole source to the Canadian company. And sure, they could say, heck, you did so well with those 2 $15,000 purchases. We're going to jump right up to a $380,000 acquisition rolling in and have CCC come on in and do the whole thing. But that's not that likely. Start small, be patient, be persistent. This is the moment where things genuinely get easier, not emotionally, structurally. CCC doesn't make risk disappear. It reallocates risk in a way that contracting can live with. That's why CCC feels powerful here and why it doesn't fit earlier. By the time CCC enters, the relationship already works. CCC is making it scalable. This section is about small moves that reduce risk, specifically at the contracting layer. End user needs can vary wildly from one command to another. Contracting concerns much less so. No matter where you are in DoD, contracting professionals are accountable for the same 3 things: defensibility, compliance, documentation, and avoiding regret. That's why getting micro-engagement right here has a much higher return than almost anywhere else. We're going to look at how to do that calmly, correctly, and in ways that the people in the contracting shop actually welcome. Before we talk about how micro-engagement works with contracting, I want to reset what we mean by that term. If you're familiar with Brené Brown's work, you may remember her research on trust, how it's built everywhere, not just in the Department of Defense. Trust accumulates one small interaction at a time. A micro-engagement is deliberately small, not because you don't have more to say, but because size signals risk. A small move, so it doesn't demand time or permission. It's useful, so it earns attention without asking for it. And it's low risk, so engaging with you doesn't feel dangerous. It's mission specific. It's grounded in their reality and their everyday problems, not your offer. A micro engagement is not a pitch. And it's not even a micro purchase. It's a contribution. This is the discipline. Not many people, not many problems, not many ideas. And remember, this is never, how can I help you? When you ask, how can I help you? You're giving them homework, and that drops your query to the bottom of the pile. This is the same definition that we've been using all along. It matters even more here because the contracting layer, anything that feels big or vague or risky or creates more work doesn't land. So instead of steps or tactics, think in terms of contributions contracting already knows how to use. Instead of saying, how can I help you? Come through this door saying, how I can help you makes all the difference. These are some examples. They're not intended as templates. I want to be very clear about that. They're different in form, but they all do the same job. They reduce workload, they reduce uncertainty, and most important, they reduce mission risk. Based on what we're seeing in award data, for example, here's something that you could say. Based on what we're seeing in award data, these 2 or 3 contract vehicles might be viable for work supporting this end user and program. So you're framing this as, am I thinking about the right lanes? And the outcome is they do a sanity check. You're not asking them to commit. Why it works, it shows you've done your homework. It helps them narrow options, but avoids forcing a recommendation. The second one, an acquisition strategy clarifier. For example, here's a short comparison. Say, here's how this requirement could work under simplified acquisition rules, and here's how it could work under task order, and here's how it might work under full and open competition. So you're explicitly framing these as implications, not as preferences. Why it works? It helps them anticipate justification questions, reduce work later, keep ownership with the contracting officer. Third one, best practices. Instead of saying, how can I help? It explores the idea we just want to follow proper protocol. What's yours? We want to be your best vendor ever. We're not in a hurry. We're here to learn, and we want to get things right the first time. For a requirement like this, what's the one operational practice you really appreciate when a vendor gets right? If they need a prompt, you can say, sometimes it's something as simple as invoicing or documentation. Does anything come to mind? Or what are the top 2 or 3 problems vendors create for your team, and how can we avoid those from the start? Here's why that works. It surfaces hidden friction, signals respect for their workload, produces insight you can act on quietly, and of course, if you ask this question, take notes, because now you're setting yourself up for the expectation that you heard and understood their answer. Past performance translation check. Do you have a one-pager for them that can map out your commercial or allied or prior DoD work and how the experience you had there would translate well into showing you could meet DoD's need? You can ask, hey, does this translate the way we think it does? Your contracting lives in interpretation. They want to reduce evaluation risk. So you're not bragging. You're just asking, hey, does this thing over here that we did look a lot like the requirement you're trying to meet? Another one, compliance readiness snapshot, really light. You can frame this question as, hey, is there anything here that would that stop this before we got started? And this is a query that works because it prevents surprises later, lets them flag red lights early, and protects them as much as you. You can do a reality timeline check. If this were to move forward, what time constraints like fiscal year end contracting, what's the earliest defensible window you'd expect? Helps them manage internal expectations or avoid pressure, and it signals your maturity as a contractor. I want to recap a term that has specific implications for contracting that are distinct from their value for end users. The term rough order of magnitude, ROM. It's not a quote, it's not a proposal, and it's definitely not a commitment on either side. It's a common term in DoD acquisition, contracting, and financial management, and it refers to a quick or easy stage, non-binding cost estimate. Just real quick, things that don't belong in the kit bag right now: capability briefings without context, you saying we can do anything, requests that require them to coordinate internally, anything that sounds like pre-decision lobbying. And so, in short, if it feels like you clarified thinking but didn't push a decision point, you're in the right zone. So with that, again, real quick, micro engagement is useful, small, low risk, mission specific. So from research to the first move, the research is the setup, micro engagement is the move. It's the right move after you understand the work after you anticipate friction, after you know who carries risk, and after you can help without asking. I want to make sure we left time for questions.